This particular series of lessons we're calling Leading Like Jesus, and we're looking at Christ as a leader. We almost always think in spiritual terms, but this time we're going to look at him as a leader. In this particular lesson, I'm calling it the communication of Jesus. We're going to talk about his style of teaching and communicating, the way that he was able to do that so effectively. We'll use for a text Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 1 and 2. And seeing the multitudes, he, speaking of Jesus, went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then it goes into the teaching that we call the Sermon on the Mount, beginning with the Beatitudes. I love to study the way that Christ communicated, the way he taught, and there was times, of course, that he preached, and both of those are important, teaching and preaching, but I come, from the old school. I've been around quite a while, and when I was a young preacher, I struggled with seeing so many needs for teaching, but they didn't want teaching back then. They wanted a fiery evangelist, and I remember my wife wisely counseling me and saying, they don't want teaching, they want you to preach as an evangelist. And I'm saying, but this is what they need. You say, it might be what they need, but it's not what they want, and you're frustrating them. Oh, she was so correct, as usual. But I'm so glad that there's been a major shift in the church today so that teaching has become very accepted. It's a part of our church life now. Now, let me first of all give some introductory thoughts concerning Christ. He didn't have PowerPoint. He didn't have the electronic tools that we use for communicating today, but yet he did it so well, so effectively, without the electronic tools. In fact, speaking of the way that he was able to teach the masses, Jesus would literally speak to thousands of people, thousands of them at one time. How did he do that? Well, he wisely chose natural amphitheaters. For instance, the scripture I just read to you, and it's one of the reasons I chose this text, is because when he was seated, his disciples came to him and he taught them, saying. Now, if you've ever been to that particular part of Israel, up on the Sea of Galilee, what they call the Mount of Beatitudes today, it's just like a natural amphitheater. And the people can just be seated, and Jesus would be able to sit down and just talk to them because of the natural acoustics. Another one of the things that he did, he used the seashore very effectively. Remember the time when he said that the people pressed upon him? I never really understood that until I went to India, and in India, I came to understand what press meant. I remember being caught once in a crowd. They weren't being unruly. They just wanted me to touch them, to pray for them. And they kept backing me up until they had me against the platform, a high platform about 8 foot high. And they backed until I couldn't even breathe. They were suffocating me. And I just threw my hands up, and they on the platform reached down and pulled me straight up onto the platform. So I come to understand what that word pressed meant. They pressed upon Jesus, and Jesus motioned to Simon Peter and says, bring your boat, let me use your boat. It created a perfect natural amphitheater for him to be able to teach them, because the sound waves would bounce off of the water onto the shore there. So he was able to do that effectively. In this lesson, I want to talk about, though, his teaching techniques, the things that he did that helped us to still be able to remember the things that he taught. The first thing I will talk about, he used stories. He was a master storyteller. He would use stories, and he would always start with something they understood. Now, that's important. And I've traveled the world preaching the gospel, and this is one of the reasons I love to use the Old Testament stories. It's because it illustrates spiritual truth. And once I give them the story, then I tell them what the story means. And it makes it an easy way of communication. Jesus did that. In fact, they tell us that we don't learn anything except building upon something we already know. Something we have already learned, we take and we add to that. So Jesus would take the natural things and he would add the supernatural to it. He would take natural things and he would explain spiritual truth to them out of those things. He would gently move them from the known to the unknown. Now, that's a wise way of teaching. And as I said, one of the main ways that he did that was by telling stories. He did what we would call painting word pictures. One of the best preachers I ever knew in my life. He's dead and gone to heaven now, but I can still remember sermons I heard him preach 40 years ago. How can I remember that so? Because he would paint such a word picture in your mind. It was impossible for you to forget the sermon because of the word pictures that he gave. Oh my, I worked on that. I tried really hard to improve, but there's a real gift to that, a talent to that. And it's one of the reasons I've gone to PowerPoint, because I'll have a picture in my mind, but if you can find a way that you can give them a picture, I can do that with PowerPoint. They tell us that 40% of all people are visually oriented. And it means if you give them words, text, it's just words. It all runs together for them. But if you can show them a picture, they've got it. Now, because they were an agricultural society, Jesus used a lot of farming illustrations. And it was because of their culture. And of course, they didn't have the electronic world we have today. So, but if Jesus was in our day and time, I believe he would use a computer. I believe he would use illustrations that you and I can relate to in our modern world. So this was one of his teaching techniques. The second thing I will focus on is Jesus used focus. Focus. In other words, his stories only had one main point. Now, being a teacher, this is one of the areas that I get carried away. It's one of the weaknesses in my style of communication is I try to communicate too much information. It's one of the big problems that we're having today in the modern world is there's an information overload. Jesus didn't do that. He would tell a story that had one main point. And he would make sure that they understood that one main point. Now, by using this technique, it helped the people remember what he said. Oh my, what a shame that so many preachers, that by the time you get home, you've already forgot the sermon. What a waste. And not only a waste of energy and time, but the resources and all the things that it goes to developing a message. But because we try to communicate too much, they get lost in the rush and they forget what we have said. For instance, think of Jesus' teaching. Do you remember a particular story where Jesus talked about a pig? Of course we do. The prodigal son. We almost immediately think there was a man that had two sons, and the one said, "Give me my inheritance," and he ends up in the pig pen. We remember that so clearly because he focused on this. Another one of his stories, he used the story about 10 silver coins, and the woman lost one. Now, in that culture, that story meant a lot more to them than it does to you and I. It's easy for us to remember it because it's simply about 10 silver coins. And she lost one, she sweeps the house, she gets a candle, she's looking everywhere for the silver coin. But in that culture, that was a wedding gift. Her husband had given that to her when they were engaged to be married. It was a wedding gift. And in her carelessness, she had lost one of the silver coins that her husband had given to her when they were engaged for marriage. So no wonder that the people could so quickly relate to what he was saying and remember what he was saying. See, if they can't remember what we said, then what's the use in saying it? We're wasting our time and their time. Jesus did not make that mistake. He focused on one point and drove that message so clearly home. Now, a third thing I see, that Jesus was a master at using surprise. His stories would have so many surprise endings, things that you never thought about. For instance, we just mentioned about the prodigal son in the pig pen, and then finally he gets back home, and what's the surprise? His older brother wasn't happy about him coming home at all. He was upset about it. There was always that hook in the story, that point where he would prick your conscience. See, the truth is, people become lazy in their thought patterns. Now, here's what I mean by being lazy in our thought patterns. We assume we already know the way the story's going to end. That is just human nature. And we're always jumping ahead, jumping to conclusions. With Jesus, it was hard to jump ahead because he would put that surprise in there, something you were not expecting, anticipating at all. Now, why did he do this? Different reasons, but here's one of the main reasons. He liked to use surprise to make them think. Now, I know for a lot of people, thinking is not something they like to do, but Jesus was a master at making people think. And so it's like sticking a dart in the board. He would use the unexpected to grab their attention. And he was a master at this. He would talk about, for instance, a man going out and hiring men, and he hired them for so much money a day to work for him in his vineyard, in his harvest. And he goes back at noon. He goes back at 3 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, there's only 1 hour that is left in the day, and he's still going back saying, come work in my harvest. I need to get this harvest in. And when he come to the end of the day, those that only worked 1 hour, he paid them the same amount he had agreed to give those that worked all day long. So when they came, they thought they would get more. Jesus uses a surprise twist. He paid them the same wages. Now, why does he do that? It's like sticking a dart in our minds. It's that sharp point. It's like the hook that grabs you so that you can't forget it. Because of that surprise ending, see what it does, Jesus knew by giving a surprise ending, it would cause people to talk about the story. They're going to tell their friend about this. They're going to share it with somebody else. Now, he understood that we remember the things we talk about. Oh, may God help us. To be an excellent communicator, to be a master communicator as Jesus was and is, it's a great challenge. It's not easy. You have to really work. You have to prepare. You've got to do everything that you possibly can to be a master communicator. But because Jesus was so effective in his communication, we still remember what he said 2,000 years ago. We still talk about these stories. Preachers still preach them because they were such excellent communication. May God help us to learn from the teaching style of Jesus. Now, here's a fourth one that I want to give. In Jesus' teaching style, his communication, he used repetition continually. He didn't do it because he had run out of something to say. And that's something we must beware of as preachers and teachers. Don't just keep repeating it because you don't have anything else to say. No. Use it very intentionally. deliberately. If you're going to repeat it, make sure there is a good reason for repeating it. See, it's said that repetition is the mother of all learning. And I've already stated that everything that we learn is built and based on something we already know. That's a proven fact. So if we are using repetition wisely, then we are teaching them. Research shows us that we remember the things that we repeat. And this is one of the reasons when I hear something, a good story or a good illustration or example or such, I like to share it with somebody just as quickly as I possibly can, because in giving it away, I get to keep it. I will remember it. This is repetition. For instance, your ABCs. ABCs, we start when our children, our grandchildren are very small, and we'll even make little jingles out of it. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I mean, we'll add musical lines to it such because it helps them to remember it, our ABCs. What about multiplication tables? Many of us hated that, didn't we? Oh my, and I think it's one of the ways that modern education is failing a lot of young people today is because they don't know their multiplication tables, and if anything happens to their computer, they can't even give you change. That's sad. Multiplication tables, but everything that you learn in math is based on that. And it's not just math and not just the English language. What about music? The song Silent Night. Anybody sing Silent Night? Of course, the moment you hear those words, Silent Night, Holy Night. How did you remember that? We know it by repetition. See, none of us sat down and deliberately, intentionally memorized Silent Night. And yet we all know it by heart because year after year, every Christmas, we sing it again. And by singing it year after year, we've all memorized the lyrics. We all know the song. Now, this is what Jesus is doing. He's using repetition and repeating the things that he wants to emphasize, the things he wants to make sure that they do not forget. He wants to firmly stick those in their minds so that they can share them with others. He does it by repetition, and it's one of the great tools that can be used by master teachers and preachers in communicating the gospel, in communicating to an audience the things that are important, the things you don't want them to forget. Now, let me talk about a fifth area. A fifth area that Jesus was a master in his communication is using questions. He was very good at this. See, a good question at the right time is an invaluable tool in teaching. It's one of the things that I don't like about speaking to large audiences because you are limited in the interaction that you can have with the audience. You can do much better job at communicating with a small group because you get the interaction. Ask questions. Prompt them to ask questions. Jesus was a master at this. He used a style of teaching that prompted people to ask questions, like his surprise endings. They never thought of that before. Boy, that is a surprise. I mean, and by doing this, it would cause them to ask questions. So the first thing that Jesus did with questions was Jesus would answer their questions. It's an excellent style of teaching. By answering their questions, it's what we call he's scratching them where they itch. He knows what they're dealing with. And so by doing this, by prompting them to ask questions and then responding and answering the questions, he's communicating truth in a way that they're not going to forget. Now, the problem for so many teachers and preachers is We're talking about things that people are not talking about. We're answering questions that nobody is asking. And because we're answering questions that nobody is asking, they don't recognize this is the answer to my need. We need to develop means of communication, whatever we have to do. In our society, we become such a multimedia culture. And it's one of the reasons that I have gone to using PowerPoints and using all of these different electronic tools is because I can remember telling my wife a few years ago, and telling her, I've got to buy the computers, I've got to buy the programs. I even had to carry my own projectors in those early years because I said, if I don't learn how to do this, if I don't master this, in 10 years I will just be another old preacher. But if I can master this, 10 years from now, I can still effectively be communicating. So that's why I do it. I'm interested in finding ways that will help me communicate so that they will remember what I'm talking about. Now, what I've got to do, I've got to connect with my audience. I've got to be answering their questions. I've got the things they're already talking about. I've got to connect with them. And that's one of the wise reasons why we need to take current events, things that people are talking about, and wrap them in our sermons. I remember there was a terrible, terrible accident off the coast of England, and there was a lot of people that died in the accidents. And what is Charles Spurgeon called the Prince of Preachers? He gets up the next Sunday morning and he starts talking about pain, pain. Where is God when we hurt? What was he doing? He was connecting with what they're already talking about. Now, the second way that he used questions, he would ask them questions. Now, remember, you've got to learn to ask good questions. If you ask a bad question, you're going to get bad information. You've got to learn to ask good questions. And Jesus did that. A good question will give the teacher insight to where the student is in his life. What he's thinking about, what he understands, what he doesn't understand, what he's struggling about. A good teacher, it allows the teacher to be able to look into the student's mind and understand what is his struggles, what does he need to know, how can I best help him? And so Jesus did that. He not only answered their questions, but he would ask them questions. A good communicator learns to do this. A good question at the right time is able to not only communicate, but you read your audience. And as you read the audience, you're able to tell where they are spiritually, where they are mentally, what they're thinking about. And you're able to be more effective in helping them in those ways. And then the third way that Jesus used questions, Jesus would question their answers. Now notice the way that he starts out. He's answering their questions and he is giving them questions and now they're responding. And when they respond, the third level is he would question their answers. Let me give you an illustration of this. Jesus, before his crucifixion, he knew this was going to be a big event. It's going to shatter their world. They're not going to understand what is going on. And so he's trying to prepare them and to help them to know what is coming and what they need to do. And he said, do you believe that I'm the Christ? Oh, yes, we believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And then he looks them in the eye and he says, do you really believe? Now, why is he questioning their answer? He's making them think on a deeper level. He's causing them to search themselves if they're really being honest in what they're saying. See, we can just become religious people with religious cliches that we just spout them off without even thinking about that. Jesus didn't permit that to happen. Jesus would use questions, questioning their answers, to make them think about what they just said. Do you really believe? This is an excellent way of teaching. See, the goal of the teacher, and this is what Jesus did, and I have tried to model my ministry after this as much as I possibly can. The goal of the teacher is more than imparting information. That is not my goal at all. I'm not interested whether the people think I'm smart, intelligent, ignorant, dumb. And that's immaterial. I could care less what they think about me. What's important to me is I want to communicate information that can be understood, can be remembered, and can be put into practice. Now let me repeat that again, because I've seen so many preachers, they just spouting off information, and they're a fountain of information that, it's worthless trivia. Nobody cares about it. I don't want to be a warehouse of worthless trivia. I want to be able to connect with people with truth that will help their lives. I want to be able to communicate information that can be understood, can be remembered, and can be put into practice. If not, I'm wasting both their time and my time. It's more than just a cliche that is said, the teacher hasn't taught until the student has learned. Boy, that is the truth. That's what Jesus did. And because he did it so well, we're still talking about the stories that he told 2,000 years ago. That's excellent communication. That's a master at communication. And we can learn from his style and emulate that, follow that, and it will help each of us to become better communicators in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. May God bless you in your Christian life.